Could you explain your role in Kansas City, Missouri School District during the years between 1971 and 1997?
Yes, I can. At the beginning of the time, I was a classroom teacher, but by the 80s, I went to Swinney in 1985 as principal, and I was one of 5 schools that were the original 5 that were magnet schools, and I had a big job to do in a short amount of time, because they were, when I went in, they were not sure what was going to happen, how this plan would be written to accommodate the schools that they had chosen. And in probably maybe 3 months, I had to select a staff, I had to order materials, and get ready for a new school. Just prior to that, the year before, we had been moved out of the building because part of the desegregation effort was to revitalize buildings. And Swinney went through a construction period of about a year. And then we came back, and thus started all the other things. Now, what I remember pretty vividly about starting, when I became a part of the desegregation effort, there was not a desegregation team at that time. And many people that are people that I learned to know were Gene Eubanks, Don Waldrop, Dan Levine, and many others that I did not know. However, I think when they put this committee together, it didn't seem as though it truly represented the community, which was an argument all the time between the politicians, the unions, and the community at large. Everybody wanted their person on that committee. After that started, I think I was just in awe of the tasks that I had going forth, because I had no idea where I was going. The plan wanted to bring white children back to the city. And in an effort to do that, there were all kinds of issues going on at the time, where the outlying districts were chosen to be a part of the suits, but what happened, the judge threw them out. Judge Clark at the time wanted everything to be seamless. However, that was hard to do, because part of the plan represented transportation as the biggest issue, just below what the cost of renovating buildings were going to be. But when the transportation effort started, kids came from as far away as way north, 10, 15 miles near Liberty. And I had kids who came from south as far as Grandview. This program was set up to suggest that if kids lived as far away and wanted to attend a school in the city, they were able to do so with no cost to the parents on transporting them. Many children came in cabs, because there may not have been any more than 1 or 2 kids in that family. In the afternoons, they wanted something that attracted even more, which was the before and after school programs. And then they wanted the children who lived in the community that went to private schools that were white, somehow to attract them back into the neighborhood schools. And we had a population that, not a population, but a range of percentages that we had to keep at that time. It was 60% white and 40% black or other minorities. It wasn't hard for me to do because at that time the line was truced and over. So I was fortunate to pull in so many kids that were white from Maine and over. And so I never had a problem with the population, with mine becoming stabilized. During that effort, I think the plan wanted to have more community involvement. So surely I was young then and energetic, and anything that I could attend, I did it to promote magnet schools. I sat on boards, etc., trying to make people know that I knew what I was doing, and that I could run the school. So many of my parents at that time came from Hyde Park. They came from the Valentine area, and all of these areas are pretty well established, older, very high income parents. And so what my demographics looked like was that I had the range of doctors down to people that were on aid from the state aid. So I never had the problem, never, in attracting kids. My biggest concern during that time, however, was what kind of setup am I going to have that will draw these people into the city? And I knew all of the effective things that they tell you about a school, that you need a good leader, you have to have a good climate, have good teachers, and on, parents feeling that they are comfortable in coming to the school. So that was a framework from whence I could follow in determining what would I do with this new challenge. The community responded. If you were black, you responded negatively. If you were white, it was fairly positive. However, I couldn't go out publicly, but because people knew who I was then and said, oh, you work at that school, that, whatever. But it didn't bother me because I knew I had a job to do. So what I did community-wise, I mean, I've never attended so many parties, picnics, special guests at community functions and all. I mean, I was gone probably through 8 and 9 o'clock every night. But I knew as my job entailed that the community had to feel comfortable with me being over there at that school, because at that point in time, I think I may have been the second black principal who was in the school district on that side of town. Mr. Shoemate was the principal at Volker, which was a coordinating school with me. It took the kids from after they left me, and they went to Volker. But by then, the community knew that we were well established. And, you know, one of the things that I truly believe that they believed, well, that they felt, that they trusted me. And I think trust was a big factor with all of that, because, you know, the unions were fighting, saying it was equity was not present with the other schools in the school district. But, you know, I sort of let it rise over me rather than get pulled away from what my job truly was. Pretty typically in Kansas City, the dividing line is Troost, as far away as Troost east and then the state line west. However, the way the plan was set up, it was more Main Street to the east and then over to state line and then as far away north as a parent wanted to come. The interesting part about what other people didn't know, that a large segment of my parents who were minorities did come from across the line over past Troost. So we were pretty intentional about making sure that we brought in kids from all over, especially minority students, because I felt that it was my responsibility. And I did a lot of reaching out to families at church and everywhere else. So yes, that's what over there means, the dividing line in this city, which is pretty much the same today. In my opinion, the integration plan divided people who didn't want to think outside of the box, who didn't want to see change. And, it was almost a convincing job on my part to say, it's not what you think. They thought that, that we worked too hard. We had too many staff developments. The eye was on us from the outside. That we were never just a teacher. So, and administratively, it was the same way. They wanted the stuff, which represented all the resources, but they didn't want to put forth the efforts that were needed to take care of to follow the plan. So I think it divided us even more. Pretty much so. The people that were around me at the time at principals meeting, etc., you could feel the division. And of course, I really didn't care because it was about the kids. I can say honestly, the kids' attitude about the plan was just magnificent because these kids had no filter in terms of I'm sitting next to a black kid or I'm sitting next to a Mexican kid. No thought whatsoever. They came in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and their parents were as well, because they knew that this was going to be a new innovative process, and they felt impelled to come. If they didn't like it, they had a choice of leaving. And I think in this city, it was the first effort of us having something that's called school of choice, that they came and they liked it and they stayed until the transportation strings, when the money began to span out and all other schools were a part of the plan, it became too hectic because parents who lived in the city that had jobs in the city would be able to come and bring their kids still, but those that had no transportation, that lived on farms or whatever, they went back to their original way. My major contribution to the plan, I believe, is that I was clearly open-minded and excited about being a part of this new innovation. I think I gave kids the belief that they could do anything that they wanted to do, but they had to get a foundation. I believe I contributed efforts that were put in place to make a staff become cohesive, training them well. One of which was we did an exercise where we had to depend on each other, because that's the whole premise of having a magnet school, is that we make sure that people feel comfortable with each other, because you're going to spend a lot of time together. So we took a trip, and I don't ever want to go there again. We were in the wild, and cabins, and there were mice running around, etc. But that, at least, it was a happy thought afterwards. It wasn't too pleasant during the exercise. I think I also contributed that the whole mindset of community, because I made sure that we did so many activities in the run of a month that was all family oriented, so that the kids saw their parents there, and the parents were happy. Happy kids, happy parents. So I think that was my biggest worry, is convincing parents that it's going to be okay. I think I also contributed the leadership that was needed for this project to work, because no matter what anyone said, and I look back now and say, you shouldn't have done that. But I was a strong disciplinarian. And I felt at the time that if I didn't have a school that had a good climate, who's going to come? And parents had to feel that their kids were safe when they were not with them. I think also I contributed a presence in their community, where, they'd see me in the grocery store, or not that I was looking for people, but I did have to eat, and they'd see me and said, "Oh, Miss Washington." Well, kids always do that. They don't think that we do anything but work at schools all the time. I think I contributed avenues for kids to be exposed, whether some of our population may have gone to great field trips or whatever, but our plan was that every kid in that school would experience 10 trips a year to some place that they may not have otherwise have been able to go. What I can recall from, I came to the district in '68, and not much was discussed about outcomes then. However, I knew they were declining, and integration was so new to everyone that I remember in '71, they put me at, my first job was at Volker, and I walked in and there were no kids. And Dr. Shoemate was my principal. He said, "That's okay, Phyllis. Don't worry about it. They'll come." Well, by week 3, I may have had 8 children. So they finally pulled the kids and created a classroom within the ones that they had. So I literally sat for 2 months without any children, and no one at the school spoke to me. It was a small school, 10 teachers, and I was in my room all the time. And coming from where I've come from, the South, I kind of got it, but I didn't, because I thought, anybody should be able to speak to you and treat you cordially. However, when the scores were declining, and I knew that I was going to Swinney in 85. I made it my mission that, their scores had been pretty good anyway. But I wanted to make sure, with all the changes that were going to occur, that by no means would our scores drop. So after 3 years, and our scores continued to climb. Every year they climbed. And to the point that I said, why don't we apply for the Blue Ribbon Award? Well, no school had ever done, no elementary school, as I know, had ever done so. And we did it just to give us an exercise, just to give us some data to see where we had started and then where we were. Well, we won the Blue Ribbon Award for Swinney. And that in itself made people say, oh, they must be doing something over there. So they are really into academics. And I often told parents that if it's not good enough for my kid, it shouldn't be good enough for yours. But at that time, they wouldn't let the kids cross lines, so my kids could not attend. But academic outcomes were pretty much so. You may have had 5 to 10 schools that were doing okay across Kansas City. Some holding stable and some not. But it became the crust of everybody's discussion then. We got to get these kids' scores up. We got to do this. And I think we were taking then the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. And our kids continued to do well. But in order to have good academic outcomes, you got to have all these other things in place, which more than anything we had done. We did 125 hours of staff development every year. And how we did it, I don't know, but we did it. And so I wanted to make sure that teachers had no excuses about, well, if I'd known how to teach this, I would be okay. If I only had this resource, I'd be okay. There was not anything that they would ask for that they didn't get. And which I believe was part of the problem with other schools. But in my heart of hearts, I believe what we tried to create at Swinney is what should be at every school. It shouldn't be that big of a difference in terms of the quality, the outcomes of good teaching, what it represents. Some of the social outcomes for students were, for the first time, white parents were taking minority kids home with them to spend the night, to go to activities. I just remember vividly that there were kids that I took home and that spent a night or so, and the parents would come and pick them up. Also, there were events that, and then it went vice versa, attending birthday parties and the families feeling free enough to let their kids, to take them, as well as the other way where we look at a minority kid coming to stay with a white family, attending church together. Events that we created at the school site. I remember us having so many parties on that playground that the apartment complex people from both sides would come out and watch because they thought we had a big band and people were picnicking and laughing and talking, and I think we provided the resources to create good social interaction with children. And I talk to the kids almost every day. I'd bring them in the auditorium and talk about what I expected them to do. And I think that made a huge difference in what kids believed and what they saw. It was the same. What worked and what didn't work. I don't believe all of us didn't have the same beliefs that it would work. I don't think, and that meant administrators, board members, etc. The union spent a lot of time in my building. However, I made them feel welcome and they stopped coming. What worked, however, was the fact that we had a mission and I was determined that it was going to work with us. On the flip side of it, I think what had happened was that some of the other schools lost sight of what they were doing and started changing things and creating other things that were not a part of the plan. And I think more than anything, not a lot of effort was placed into, communicating with other people on their level, as opposed to being pretty aloof to what the parents knew. I believe that what didn't work was that most of the schools were so large and you didn't get a chance to know who your population was. So you could not, if you didn't get out there in the communities and mingle with them, then you didn't know anything about what you were doing. I believe that something else that probably didn't work, even though I said that the transportation was great, many times these kids stayed on in a cab for an hour and a half to get here and another hour and a half to get home. It was dark. So I don't think that worked too well. I think they should have had, say, a guideline to North Kansas City or just north of the river, and we won't extend this any farther than that, transportation. I think they gave people money when the budget was given out. Many of my colleagues didn't know what to do with the money, that they were trained, but they weren't trained. So consequently, what they do is spend money on things that I would never spend money on, because I thought it was for children. It was for anything that created the atmosphere that I needed in the buildings, and outside too, because no one that I know of would have had a parade in the middle part of a great neighborhood during Halloween and me dressed up in hot in this costume. But we went block after block after block, probably a mile and a half. But that, to me, signified people who were questioning what we were doing. Here they saw an entire school walk around in the neighborhood. But I don't think anybody else would have done that. And even if I suggested some of the activities that we were doing, they were, no, I'm not doing that. So I think all of those little nuances created problems for everyone. And people started drawing back and said, well, they aren't working. What are they doing with all of this money? Do we need this many schools? And some of the places that they created, the buildings and all, I think some of them may have been doomed from the beginning because they had problems before, and certainly the problems didn't go away. They remained. I can tell you that story. In that I've changed my entirely, in 99 I left the district. But what I knew, I went away with ideas that I knew part of what was magnet and part of what I had determined from being a mom, that you sort of knew what kids needed. So I think what happened in order to, the kinds of things that our schools need now, definitely smaller high schools. These massive high schools with even 400 or 500 kids in them. The administrator doesn't know these kids, and they come to school with so many complicated problems. And if you don't deal with it, they aren't going to do anything academically and be successful in school. I look at, I was one who said, class size doesn't matter. And I still contend that it doesn't if you have the structure in place that needs to be. Even though in some of my classrooms I have 2 teachers working simultaneously, but in others where the teacher is pretty creative and she has it together and we don't know how she does it, but she does manage her room well, then I say you need that variety. I think that kids have to have more in schools where they can touch and feel and create and do things that are in groups as opposed to not being hands-on. I also believe that if I need the protection of a metal detector in a school, then I have not created a safe environment. I don't like them, I've never used them, and my board now knows that if they ever suggest putting one in, then I'm gone. But I think all of those pieces create problems for the student. There needs to be almost a 1 to 10 counselor, therapist, whatever, because these kids come to school with so many more problems, and there's no one that you can afford to hire and keep it together. But I think having the schools of choice now, that we've created another problem because people don't like it because they are saying that we're taking the smartest of kids, which is not the truth. I wish it were, but it is not the truth. So I think what we could easily do is reconstruct how we look at schools and how we look at the people that are going to be inside those schools. Because you cannot say, oh, I'm not going to take that kid because he's special ed or he's whatever. But you got to have the resources there to help create the environment that you need. And I think basically some of the things that were really great for magnet schools they parallel some of the things that I would do now as a charter school, because most of what we did in magnet schools, it worked. But when the ceasing of money started to decline, and then before long it was like just the bottom of the barrel, that you had to try and operate and replicate what you had in the beginning. So, not that I believe money is the answer to doing everything to help schools be supportive, but I think that there has to be a fair amount of resources, financial resources, that are available so that you don't give teachers another out by saying, I don't have. So I think that all of that will work, are things that can work and will work in our next century of kids.